Our next speaker is Mitchell Hora. He is a seventh-generation Southeast Iowa farmer and the co-founder, CEO of Continuum Ag, a soil health data intelligence company. The Horas have been using no-till systems since 1978, cover crops since 2013, and have gotten creative with relay cropping, 60-inch corn, and more. Mitchell expands his efforts globally with Continuum Ag's 38-state and 16-country reach. The group launched Topsoil as the first soil health data platform in 2020 and works with farmers globally to successfully adopt regenerative farming systems. So if you will all help me in welcoming Mitchell.
Thanks, sir. All right, sweet. Yeah, take that one. Yeah, I was telling the guys, at any point, if you guys want to slow me down and ask questions and stuff while we go, definitely all for it. If we want to dig a little bit deeper into any of the stuff, or if you got questions, so just raise your hand. The guys got a couple of the mics. I'm happy to do that. So he laid that well, in my intro here already. My family farms down in southeast Iowa. Washington is kind of where we're at. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, talking about the soil health principles, how we are implementing them, how we're making them profitable for our family operation. But wanted to start with a couple other things here to kind of get stuff started as well. A big thing for me, being seventh generation, we've got the eighth generation on the ground. It's about thinking long term. It's about making sure that as we're thinking about sustainability, as we're thinking about implementing these soil health principles, we've got to do it in a manner that's profitable now and is going to be resilient over the long haul. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. With Continuum Ag, really what we do is help with the how-to and try to continue to provide the nuanced data and data tracking and stuff like that. A huge part of this regenerative journey for each of our farms is that we've got to document what we are doing because it's going to become extremely valuable in the supply chain where the consumers want to know where their food's coming from, how it's produced, where that quality is going to become an important factor. It was brought up before that today it's all just about quantity. It's all just about what we produce, but it's becoming more and more important to understand how we are producing as well. We got a long way to go, though. Across the country, there's only about 4% of farms using cover crops, only about 30% of farms using no-till. These are from the 2017 census numbers. Hopefully you guys fill out your census information, and we'll see some improved numbers on these metrics, but we got a long way to go. And as you guys have seen, implementing these things can be really tough. And that's where making sure that we've got data to understand how to logistically do this, and it's going to be different for every single one of your farms. Understand how to make the logistics work so the economics can work as well, because this has to be profitable. And as I talk to companies, I say sustainability is great, but sustainability really only matters if the farm is going to be economically sustainable as well. And sustainability isn't only about environmental sustainability, but financial sustainability, social sustainability here as well. I want to hit on carbon just a little bit. It's not the core part of the talk here today, but it is a key thing that I've been looking at a lot and a really important thing to talk about here real quick. You guys are, I'm sure, hearing a lot about carbon, these carbon programs, carbon market opportunities, and maybe some of you have signed up for some or looked into some on your operation. Farm Journal data says that 93% of us as producers are aware of carbon markets, but less than 3% of farmers have pursued enrolling in one. So if you haven't, you're in the farm majority, 97%. Only 3% of farms have pursued enrolling in one of these carbon programs, but agriculture is being looked at to provide a solution here because we are part of the problem today. Food and ag is a significant component of the total greenhouse gas impact, but we're one of the few industries that has the opportunity to really become carbon negative, reverse our own impacts, and along the way, of course, get all the other positive outcomes of regenerative systems, like improving water quality, nutrient density, biodiversity, and so on. So we've really got to be able to drive this further. This is some of the things that we've been working on to be able to help and provide assistance here. With carbon, I wanted to hit on something here real quick, and actually it was brought up with the previous speaker here in this breakout. I'm seeing a shift happening here, okay, and I want to make sure that you get some core additional things to think about before I go into the soil health principles that's going to massively drive profitability for each of our farms. Today, carbon offsetting is the mode that a lot of companies are taking to try to figure out how to create carbon credits and create value in the carbon story coming from our farms, okay? Carbon offsets are where you create a practice change and trigger additionality, and you get paid based on the change in your carbon footprint. Okay, and there's a lot of rules. These programs have been around for more than 20 years, very established, and there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of regulatory. These are not a new thing. And these carbon offsets, for agriculture are tough because of looking at how permanent is that carbon in the soil. What kind of real impact are we making when things like carbon and methane and nitrous oxide are pretty tough to measure at scale across the magnitude of our operations. The shift that I'm seeing happen here, I noted kind of at the bottom, and it's around carbon intensity. Okay, so the speaker before had brought this up as well. It's what's driving the pipeline projects that are going through the ethanol and renewable fuels facilities down in Iowa, and one of those pipelines coming right up here through y'all's neck of the woods. Okay, they're doing those pipeline projects to look at reducing the scope 1 environmental footprint of that biofuel. The scope 1 impact is what is going into the atmosphere at that renewable fuel facility. Okay, so it's the emissions going up into the atmosphere. And they're using the pipelines to capture those emissions, compress it down as a liquid, and pump it into the ground out here in the Dakotas, or there's one going over to Illinois as well. The thing to note and why I'm so hot on this and want to talk about, and these are very new slides for how I typically talk, but it's so important to note this down, and you'll be some of the first producers in the country to really be made aware of this. In the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August, it increased the value of the carbon credits through those pipeline type projects. It increased the value of a ton of carbon from $50 per ton to $85 per ton. This is already happening right now, and it incentivizes reducing the carbon intensity of those fuels by a pretty significant amount. $50 a ton to $80 a ton, you can really ramp up the business models pretty quick. But the most important thing in my mind that happened with the Inflation Reduction Act is the increase in availability of a new component of tax code called 45Z. Okay, 45Q is what moved the scope 1 emission component. 45Z impacts scope 3. For an ethanol facility, their scope 1 carbon is what happens at the facility, their direct emissions. Scope 2 is the electricity that they use. Scope 3 is the supply chain, aka the corn and soybeans or other products that are being utilized for biofuel. On January 1st, 2025, 45Z takes hold where where biofuels can now utilize scope 3 carbon reductions and start generating tax credits off of those reductions. I ran the numbers on my farm already. There's a tool we can utilize called the GREET tool. We have integrations with it in our platform as well to automate this and to make sure that it's simple and utilize machine learning and stuff to help on the farm. But the GREET tool you can look at today, GREET, developed by the U.S. Department of Energy. And that's why the federal government is looking at utilizing it. One of their departments built it. And the GREET model, you can plug in some of your practices, and it tells you what your farm's carbon intensity is. Corn has a standard carbon intensity of plus 25 in the GREET model. This is 25 grams of CO2 equivalents per megajoule of energy. Doesn't matter. Plus 25 is the most important, or plus 29 is the most important thing. On our farm, we've been using no-till, using cover crops, reducing our inputs, reducing our fuel needs, reducing our horsepower needs. And our score is very conservatively minus 4.4 grams of CO2 equivalents per megajoule of energy. The delta between 29 and minus 4.4 is where this carbon intensity score becomes incredibly valuable. When the 45Q tax credit comes live, 45Z tax credit comes live for our 2024 corn, the value in those tax credits is about 60 cents per bushel for our farm. 60 cents a bushel. Say we have to share that with the renewable fuels guys or with some other third-party verifiers. There's going to be some cost to this, but say we can walk away with an extra 30 cents pretty conservatively per bushel. At the end of the day, you put that on 240 bushel corn, you're talking now some real money for implementing these practices, let alone the value that they, of course, create for our soil health and our long-term opportunities on our farm. Okay, all I wanted to do in starting with that is going to be a massive driver for opportunity within the cropping system for our 2024 crop. We need to be thinking about that right now, thinking about the cover crop that we're going to plant later this fall, thinking about the fertilizer that we're going to utilize later this fall, reducing tillage. These are all drivers of this score. It's something that we need to be looking into, and it's a huge, huge thing that we are pushing on our farm and within the company. Okay, so 45Z, huge deal. If you're not tying into ethanol, plenty of you are saying, hey, I'm not raising corn, soybeans going into that. The point there is that with credits being driven into renewable fuels and increased premiums for grain going into renewable fuels, it's going to impact everything else as well, and everything else is going to need to compete. And also, I was just down in Nashville here, flew up this morning, was speaking down there yesterday with Farm Journal Trust in Food Conference with a lot of sustainability-driven companies in the food and ag space. And these topics here is a huge piece of what is now being talked about. The opportunity to not have carbon be a new commodity on its own, but to be able to connect our carbon and our holistic environmental story with our products going into the supply chain to be able to create long-term, more balanced goals and be able to enable these companies to actually meet their net zero goals and stuff that they've been talking about. So the opportunity now to start collecting data, document the things that you're doing, take a step back and look at your operation, especially here kind of in the off season. And as you're looking at, the farming that you're going to be doing here in 2023, continue to fine tune and experiment and work with those around you to be prepared for 2024. Now, going into my actual kind of talk and stuff here, okay, I wanted to hit on that because I know a lot of people, I'm sure, are asking about carbon. Just a second, sir. There's Mike over here. I wanted to hit on that because it's a big deal. And carbon and connecting with the consumer is a huge opportunity that all of us are going to have to figure out how to play in. However, the tried and true of all of this stuff are these principles. And understanding working with Mother Nature, not against her. Understanding how to make these systems work and mimic Mother Nature to the context of your farm. Like I was talking about, I'm looking at 45Z being, just on the tax credits alone, being worth $72 an acre for our farm pretty easily. That's a big deal. Pretty nice new money coming into the bottom line. But these principles impact a heck of a lot more than $70-some an acre. And that's what I'm going to get into next. But you got a question first.
Yeah, are you saying that extra we're going to get per bushel, that's not just generic for every bushel that comes into the ethanol plant? It's being driven down to the farm level?
Great question.
We have to document what we're doing? Is that what you're saying?
Great question. Yeah, it'll be documenting what you're doing on a per field basis, or at least a per operation basis, because it'll be re-aggregated together. So each field will end up with its own carbon intensity score, but as you aggregate all that grain together, you'll probably have one score for corn, one score for soybeans or other crops. And basically, as you're selling it, they'll ask you to fill out a survey or fill out the information to run these models on it. You'll have to back this up with data. We got to have records. You got to be able to prove this stuff is real. We don't know what that'll look like yet. Maybe it'll be fill out the stuff, and if you get the random audit, in your lion, you're gonna be in big trouble. So it's gonna be, document and comply with the information as much as we can, and make sure that you can back it up after the fact. So it's essentially just connecting now that story with that load that's going to the facility and being able to back that up with a data tool. So a couple of groups that are piloting this right now. John Deere is looking at this. They got a pilot on it right now. Just at one of their facilities, ADM is piloting this right now, talking with Rabobank about it right now. A big deal of what's coming down the pipeline. The real systems go into play, like I said, January 1, 2025 is when 45Z starts. And it's using the GREET model. And the opportunity now is to identify where are you at today, what's your baseline today, and how do you farm better in 2024, 2025, and beyond, that this is going to be a big deal, whether you are going into a renewable fuel type of supply chain or otherwise, because everyone's going to end up asking about it and talk about the same stuff. And what I like is that it's pretty thorough. It's looking at your inputs and your emissions into the atmosphere. It's also looking at what you're drawing down. And it's a balance of the two. It's not just getting paid to check the box and reduce tillage or check the box and plant a cover crop, because it's going to be tough on some of your farms. Again, the context of here was talked about before, and that's the most important principle, that what I'm going to show that we're making successful and making us money on our farm, it's going to be different on yours. But what I like is that we can now utilize machine learning to say, hey, here is your holistic environmental impact. Here's the things that can help you on your operation. And here's the cost of them. And do the costs outweigh, do the costs create the benefit? You'll have the opportunity to go and do that and make sure that we're looking at the bottom line profitability as being the key driver and be as environmentally friendly as we can to drive as much value into the supply chain as possible. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to ask, are you basing this on practices that have been ongoing, like long-term no-till? Is that, if you're not making any changes, is that going to still count?
That's exactly right. That's why I love it so much too. Okay, so a lot of you, as you've been looking at these carbon offset opportunities, you have to trigger additionality, where it's only about the change in your practices. Well, those of us that have been doing this stuff for a long time, it's tough to make any type of significant change to trigger any type of real carbon offset value. Well, that's for voluntary carbon markets that look at offsetting and utilize those definitions like additionality that work in other industries that don't work that great for ag. And it's important to continue to make practice changes, of course, and continue to drive and do better. But why I do like this is exactly to your point. It looks at what are you doing right now to produce that bushel. So if you're already aware, you're already set up for this, we know it's going to impact our crops in the coming years, now you can be ready to start working that score down to garner as much of a premium as possible when that story starts becoming valuable in the supply chain. And yeah, folks that are here, you've got a leg up on everybody else. Folks that have been doing this for a long time have a leg up on everybody else. But again, we have to utilize these programs not as like the only driver of why do these things. Getting a couple extra cents per bushel is not why we should necessarily be doing this stuff. We've got to be thinking long term. We've got to be mimicking Mother Nature and implementing these principles to the context of our farm. That is the long term. Carbon, sustainability, environmental metrics. Yes, the consumer's becoming very aware of them. There's a lot of big corporate goals. The finance sector has major goals in this space. It's a big deal. It's going to continue to drive. I'm guaranteed, like throughout my entire lifetime, and I'm sure my future generations' lifetime, it's going to be a big deal. It's not going to go away. But even if the goalposts do shift, the tried and true is still understand cost of production, work with Mother Nature, build up the resiliency in your system, and try to drive as much value into the supply chain that we can. We can come back and hit on some of this stuff later. I'll try to tie it in. Very, very new concepts and stuff, but it's super important to be aware of. And I'm hanging out here tonight and stuff too. I got to take off tomorrow, but the key with the talk and stuff here was back to profiting from soil health, but also it's making sure that you're on the offense here as well, whether it be offense to get ahead of some of these tax credit opportunities. Also, I guess I didn't mention, that was about 45Z. If that fuel is going into a regulated market like California or Canada, and there's a lot of other states developing low carbon fuels markets, there's additional premium on top of what I was mentioning before for fuels that are going into those markets. So the dollars start really, really stacking up in a hurry. We need to be on the offense again to document, to gather the data, to be in preparation to be able to do this. A key back to the principles of soil health is that the real long term is to implement these principles and follow Mother Nature, follow what made our natural systems the way that they are. And that's to, number one, we've got to continue to feed that microbiome, and Dr. Nichols laid that out before, and Roy laid that out as well, and how we're all connected together. Principle number one is to not mess that up, minimize the disturbance, both physically with tillage and chemically with too much inputs going in and throwing things out of whack. In 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there's more microbes than there are people on the earth. More than 8 billion microbes in 1 teaspoon of soil. And as we learned before, it's all connected to the same type of microbes that are in our gut as well. The long-term offensive opportunity here is to make sure that we've got those microbes working for us, that they're gathering that nitrogen that we need, the phosphorus that we need, they're working together in symbiosis. We need to make sure that we're fostering a good relationship for them. And we've thrown things out of whack on a lot of our operations, that we're very bacterial dominant. We got to get the fungal communities back in that soil. We've got to be able to get the balance back in there, predators and prey and all that good stuff. And by building up these soils, of course, managing water smarter as well. Managing air and nutrient flow in and out of those soils, and make sure that we're building up that microbiome here over time. I wanted to talk on going on the offense here with this. I'm kind of gotten sidetracked now with this carbon stuff. I get a little revved up on it. It's a big deal. But from an offensive standpoint, what I mean by this is that I think a lot of times these principles that I showed, we've been taught that these principles are there as defensive tools, and they're to defend against erosion, defend against water quality, defend water quality problems, defend against potentially impeding regulations. But to really make soil health systems work and really be able to prioritize them and get them to be profitable for your operation, we have to use these things as offensive tools. Those microbes are part of my fertilizer program. They're part of my nutrient stabilizer program. They're part of my soil building program. That residue that's on the surface is part of my herbicide program. It's part of my temperature management program. That living root is part of my nutrient cycling program, part of my carbon drawdown program, part of feeding my microbes. It's got to be these part of my moisture management program, my resiliency program, my crop insurance program. It's all these offensive outcomes that directly can be utilized to improve our bottom line. Minimizing disturbance on our farm looks something kind of like this. Everything gets planted green on our farm. Ahead of corn, we like using light rates of cereal rye. I recommend winter wheat if you're worried about the rye getting away from you. But especially in you guys' neck of the woods, the options for a winter cover crop are going to be pretty limited. The key is to make sure that we get the benefit and get the growth in the spring, because we're not always going to get it in the fall and over the winter. So be patient in the spring, plant green into this stuff, and terminate it later. What we like doing on corn is planting green and then terminating usually 48 to 72 hours after planting. We can push that longer and longer and longer as we go. Now we're up to 10 to 14 days after planting before we'll terminate our cover crops. Trying to provide as much armor for that soil, minimize the disturbance of that soil as much as we can, only exposing a small little strip of black soil to warm up and to let that corn take off and not have as much competition so we can get as much benefit out of it as we can. Part of letting that cover crop really go, planting green and letting it get big, is so that we can get more armor onto that soil. Some of you that are deep into this system might be facing some of the same issue that we are, that we have a problem keeping residue on our soil surface. It didn't happen at the beginning. Now that we've got that microbiome really cranking, we've more than tripled our biological activity. Now we got to continue to feed the beast. those microbes are hungry. So we're making sure that we maximize that armor, keep that soil being built up. But as an offensive tool, like I said, that armor is helping me to manage my soil temperature. It's helping to manage against weeds so that my herbicides can be utilized more effectively and I don't have to use as much. Because of using that armor, we don't use any residual herbicides on our farm at all anymore. And one of the things that Dad wants to do this year is try to farm corn with 0 Roundup and utilize the armor, utilize the natural system to be our number one offensive proponent of fending off some of our issues like weeds. This is what it looks like that couple days after, or probably 2 weeks or so after planting corn. There is corn emerged down in there, very similar to the small corn that I showed in the picture before. And what I like using on our farm that's worked well is adding a little bit of liquid nitrogen with the herbicide. We're also playing around a lot with sugar as well. Getting more sugar into the system to enable the plant to build up its Brix level and trying to help to stimulate that plant to be healthier on its own. Plants with high Brix levels, high sugar content in the plants are great, of course, as a forage, but our insects and pathogens cannot digest those more complex molecules, and it allows us to not have to utilize those pesticides to control the insects that we've got out there. Now, it's not foolproof. Every time we had some armyworms real bad last year, we're doing a lot of non-BT corn. This system takes management. It takes being on the offense to manage against some of those pests, to manage against some of these issues, but keep in mind that this is a journey. And whenever we throw off that balance and disturb that natural system, it might save us some yield, save us some dollars in the short term, but we have to keep in mind the long term here as well. On soybeans, we plant soybeans. Key number one for making cover crops work is soybeans into cereal rye or something similar for the context of your operation. A legume type of crop into a grass cover crop that can survive the winter. For us, it's cereal rye. I like using around 45 to 60 pounds of cereal rye per acre, planted in after harvesting corn. And then the first decent days of going and planting in the spring, we're planting soybeans first. Putting soybeans into cereal rye that's only a couple inches tall, and then letting the rye and the beans grow together for even 6 weeks after planting. And that's what this is. This picture was June a couple years ago. It was a 91-degree day outside. We had terminated the cover crop in late May. The soybeans are in there about calf high. They were planted in April. This is probably about 12,000 pounds of biomass that's out there now. We had those soybeans growing with the cover crop together, that cover crop protecting those soybeans, forcing the soybeans to work, tying up that excess nitrogen, putting carbon back into the ground, and protecting our water quality, keeping the weeds at bay. We terminate this cover crop when it starts getting hot and dry, or when the cover crop starts dropping pollen, which is what happened here. So went full to seed heads coming out. Then we go in and hit it with one shot of herbicide, 0 residuals. That cover crop falls down and it helps to now be an offensive tool to keep the soybeans underneath happy. 91 degrees outside that day, 100 degrees at the top of the cover crop canopy, but at the soil down below where the soybeans were, 76 degrees. Plenty of moisture. Those beans were awesome. I think they ended up yielding like 75 bushel right there. No fertilizer, no nothing on any of our beans. The bare soil at the edge of the field where there wasn't the cover was 126 degrees. There's no moisture left in that system. Those microbes are fried in that system. And what's the first thing that's going to come back if your good guys are completely toasted out there in your soil? It's those pathogens and the weeds and all the things that we don't necessarily want. So we've got to maintain that balance of the system. Utilize that cover crop as an offensive tool. I'd mentioned briefly that we terminate the cover crop based on soil moisture. We use the living cover crop as an offensive tool to wick excess moisture out of the soil when things are cold and wet, and then kill it when it starts getting hot and dry to be that armor to keep that moisture down in the soil. Helps with plantability, helps with being able to make sure we don't have replant, that we don't have disease on those soybeans, and we can plant untreated naked soybean seed into our cover crops earlier in the year. really extend that growing season and try to continue to grow yields on our soybeans, but doing it with less and less input and really maximize the diversity component of these principles by letting the grass and the legumes grow together. Huge component of making these soil health systems profitable is we've got to figure out how to keep living roots in this system. We've got to continue to feed this soil microbiome. These microbes that are in our soils, all they know how to do is eat, reproduce, and die. And try not to get eaten first so they die too quickly. That's it. And eating's number one. We got to continue to feed them that those microbes, the majority of microbes live on and around those plant roots in that rhizosphere. And Roy was showing it earlier with those roots that he had in the pictures that have all that soil clung to them. That soil is clinging to the carbon, the exudates that those roots are putting down in the soil. And it's those exudates, those carbons, that feed our microbes. And the more we could feed our microbes, the more those cycling systems work, like Dr. Nichols was talking about. Being able to allow for the natural system to work and work in symbiotic relationship with our soils so that we don't have to spend as much money on fertilizer and spend as much money trying to force the system to work for us. Rather, we let the system do its thing and let Mother Nature be the guy, let Mother Nature do its thing here to enable us to really be more resilient, more profitable long term. On our farm, getting pretty aggressive with this. I don't recommend letting your cereal rye get quite this big at the beginning when you're planting corn into it, but it can really work, and this still worked out extremely well. I mentioned on corn, I like using the light rates of cover crop, trying to get as much diversity into there as we can with legumes like hairy vetch, crimson clover. We're going to play around with some frost seeding of some of these cover crops here this spring is our plan because we got our cover crop in really late here this past fall, and we're not able to get the legumes into the blend. It was just too late in the year, so now we're looking at adding them in the spring. It's not always going to be perfect every time, and in these soil health systems, we have to keep in mind that we might have to go to plan B, plan C, plan D. This cover crop, though, is my offensive management tool. Once again, I'm going to say it like 87 times in this talk. It's got to be an offensive tool, but that cover crop is only cereal rye. I'm not getting the nitrogen fixation. I'm not getting some of the other benefits that a more diverse cover crop cocktail would get me that I typically bank on to continue to cut back on my synthetic fertilizer inputs. So that's what we're looking at. Can we frost seed it? Can we interseed some of this stuff? And also making sure that I maximize the soybeans the year before and get as much organic nitrogen credit out of those as I can here as well. A little bit more of a close-up video here. I'd like that we've put any additional upgrades and stuff like that, put it into the planter to be able to make this stuff work. Being able to plant green, being able to balance the carbon and nitrogen ratios right there around those plants. We're putting sugar in furrow as well, using all the humics and stuff in furrow to make our biology work in symbiosis with that plant to get it up and going and let it compete in this system. At the beginning in our journey, we weren't using cover crops as an offensive tool. We were throwing out some cover crop because there was some money to be able to do it. We said, sure, here's this program, whatever, and some cost share dollars. Let's toss out some cover crop and let's do it. We just threw out the cover crop and didn't change anything. We tried planting corn right into it just like this. Ended up with about 80 pounds of cereal rye out there per acre. Didn't change the fertilizer program. Didn't have starter on the planter. Didn't change anything in our system. Planted corn green and had about a 70-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio on our Haney tests. That's what we found. Extreme carbon penalty and lost about 20 bushel the acre of yield. Taking that carrot, taking the couple bucks, saying, oh, sure, I'll go toss out this cover crop because I'm getting paid to do it, led us to lose about $100 per acre. What we found is that cover crop has got to be that offensive tool once again. We threw out a super high carbon cover crop out there and planted it way too thick and didn't change anything else in the program, tried to plant corn into it just like we had always done, and it majorly screwed us up. That led us down to utilizing the Haney test and looking at that soil as that living system, looking at the organic nutrients in the soil versus the inorganic nutrients and the carbon and nitrogen balances, the biological activity that's in that soil. And now we've been able to be much smarter to find the right tools to get us the right offensive outcomes for our operation. This is what it looks like planting soybeans into this stuff. Part of these living roots is continuing to feed that microbiome, getting those fungal communities there, building up those earthworms, building up those channels. We've been doing a lot of trials as well, testing this stuff. One of the things that I like about this picture is you can really see our moisture management, where we've got those strips of cover crop versus where we don't. This would have been just cereal rye a couple of years ago and 60-foot strips. This is the only spot on our farm that remains to this day without cover crop, and we're maintaining this trial. I think we're in year 7 or year 8 now of doing this replicated trial. One of the things we've been doing out here is really trying to manage this cover crop as that offensive tool to manage our nutrients, and documented that by using the Haney soil health test. So what we do on this plot is that we take replicated Haney tests on a weekly basis out here. We've done it on a couple different plots and done it for the last 6 years. And looking at the change in nutrient availability throughout the year as influenced by this cover crop being my offensive tool. That cover crop tying up nutrients over the winter and in the early part of the year, so I don't have issues downstream, and I'm holding on to those nutrients that I paid money for. But then when we terminate that cover crop, those nutrients get released back and become part of my side dress program, become part of my fertilizer program in season when my crop actually needs those nutrients. So we've been doing weekly testing to really learn and really understand that system. What else we got here? Trying a lot of other diverse type of stuff as well. And was mentioned in my bio, trying some 60-inch corn, especially if you've got livestock. I think 60-inch corn can be a good opportunity. I think I got a picture. Yeah. This is what some of our 60-inch corn has looked like. Now, in our operation, we're not doing straight-up 60-inch corn. We've been doing skip row, where we do plant 2, skip 1. Now, in between the 2 rows of 30-inch corn, you're not going to have near as much biomass out there. But in a plant 2, skip 1 system, we did it for 3 years and had no significant yield loss versus our normal 30-inch corn. In the plant 2, skip 1, we increased the rate in the row to about 50,000 plants per acre, so that across the entire acre, I still had about the same number of total plants, so I can attempt to get the same amount of ears per acre. But in that plant 2, skip 1, going 50,000 population in the row, they're tight, but they're not that tight. And it opens up a good window to interseed cover crops, get things established earlier, get some forage if you've got livestock to turn out there on this, but also get a lot of nutrient cycling and really get more diversity into the system. For us, we proved the concept, that you can do plant 2, skip 1, not lose yield, cut back on inputs, not need the fungicide and all that. But to really make this system work for our operation, we would need to work with another young producer and bring some livestock in there to really maximize some of the gains here. Now, we were looking at opportunity here to potentially plant something else that following year that could really utilize all those nutrients in this 60-inch gap. With our Haney test, we're showing an increase in nutrient availability the following spring to the tone of 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre and 2,500 pounds of each P and K coming out of the soil. Now, I've got naturally, inherently good soils. It's the Iowa guy. Okay, I get it. But for each of your operations too, what I'm getting at is that diverse cropping, that diverse cover crop cocktail, feed diverse microbes to stimulate diverse systems in that soil. We can really reap the benefits coming out of it on the other side. Oops, that was an important one. One of the things here with this principle of the living roots and keeping living roots out there and dwelling on this one, I kind of intertwine it in as I talk about all the other principles because I think it's so important. This is from one of my customers' farms where he was in a long-term cover crop versus no cover crop trial. On the left-hand side is after long-term continuous no-till. On the right-hand side is the same field about 30 foot away from each other. I pulled these samples in a September time frame, 30 foot away. It was soybeans growing out there. The soil on the right has had cover crops on it for 10 years. We could really see the change in the organic matter, the change in carbon, the change in that soil structure as well. But also it's the water holding capacity. It's the resiliency component to be able to continue to feed that cash crop that's growing out there, because that soil has been built up so much. But just really shows here to me that we've got to figure out how to maintain these living roots as much as we can. And I know it's tough. I know it's going to take a lot of creativity, and it's not going to work perfect every time. But that's why in the spring, when we do have something growing, we got to let it get us some benefit and plant green and get as much gain out of these tools as we can, that when we're on the offense, we've got to maximize the gains. We're getting back to our operation. Getting diversity into the system, again, mimicking Mother Nature. I was just talking about it before. Some of the things we've had good luck with is hairy vetch, crimson clover, wheat. We've done barley. There's a variety of different things, and it's going to be different for every single one of your operations. Camelina was talked about by one of the speakers before. We're trying that on our farm for the first time this year. So trying to continue to get more creative. Implementing these principles is going to be very different for every single one of our operations. We got to figure out what that's going to look like. Fostering diversity could also open up new revenue streams as well. We tried some malt barley a couple years ago, and double cropped winter barley with soybeans. We interseeded that barley as well. I mentioned that we're going to be looking at doing some frost seeding. This was frost seeded, not interseeded. Frost seeded crimson clover or peas in the springtime to try to get more nitrogen into there, and utilize that spring seeding as a way to maybe get some of these systems of diversity to work better for us. This was crimson clover, like I said, that was in that barley. We've also tried mustard as well. Got linked up with a company out of California that had us do some mustard for seed. One of my favorite things is relay cropping. And this was our first take at relay cropping. We had winter wheat, and we put soybeans into it, and then we harvested the wheat over the top of the soybeans. And it worked okay, except for that the soybeans get a little bit tall and get up there into the wheat. In our operation, we have solid seeded cover crop in the fall, solid seeded drilled soybeans in the spring, so there's no rows to work off of. If we're going to relay crop a shorter stature crop like a wheat, a barley, something like that, it's probably going to be best to do it in a row situation where you can push down the soybeans a little bit and harvest a little bit lower. In this case, it worked out okay, but we were leaving a lot of wheat out there in the field because we didn't want to clip the soybeans. A huge operation for us now, or a huge opportunity for us now, is doing this with soybeans into cereal rye. We've been doing this for the last 4 years, relay cropping soybeans in cereal rye. One, we've got the cereal rye out there already. If it looks good and things stay wet in the spring, let's just keep this cover crop growing. It forces our soybeans to work harder. It forces our soybeans to nodulate more. We're now seeing up to a 120 unit nitrogen credit for our corn crop following soybeans. That's coming from the Haney test, once again, organic nitrogen, and that's just in the top 6 inches of the soil. Forcing these soybeans to really nodulate and work harder because they have no choice to be lazy out there in our soils. They don't have a lot of nitrogen sitting around that we might have had left over from the year before from the corn residue decomposing. Those soybeans have to work with the biology. They have to figure it out on their own. And we're seeing a huge nitrogen credit, like I said, because of it. Now we're going out there, instead of spraying off the cereal rye in late May, 1st of June, like I mentioned, that we typically do when it starts dropping pollen. Instead of going out there with the herbicide, we go out with the combine in July and harvest the rye over the top of the soybeans. Again, this was drilled rye, drilled soybeans. The rye is only planted at about 60 pounds per acre. It got a little bit of fertilizer on it. A little bit of nitrogen would probably be helpful, for the yield standpoint. We did put fungicide on it as well to help with the quality and the germination of the rye. Tested 99% germ with our university tests that we did with the seed after the fact, so definitely working well. But it's 60 pounds of rye out there per acre, just like we would do with a normal cover crop, But if I've got a good stand and the conditions are right, we just let it keep on going. We've got about 160,000 seeds per acre of soybeans drilled into it. No seed treatments, no fertilizer on those, no nothing, no pesticides of any kind in this system. The key with those soybeans is that we're using super full season soybeans because we're putting soybeans into these cover crops. They've got to compete now with that big cereal rye cover crop. We harvest the rye over the top in June. We've been averaging about 30 bushel the acre. And now the soybeans are like, holy crap, what's going on with the sunlight? Because they're photoperiod sensitive. And they go, what's going on with all this new sun? And if they're in vegetative mode, they'll go, this is awesome. Look at all this sun. I'm in vegetative mode. Let's rock and roll. Let's continue to branch out and let's get some benefit. If we choose too short of a season soybean, and when we harvest, those beans are in reproductive mode, they go, whoa, what's going on with the sunlight? I'm in reproductive mode. I need to set pods and call it a day. And they never end up getting any taller, and the yields are massively hurt. Now, I'm dwelling on this one a little bit because I think for plenty of your operations, something to look at, something to consider, a way to be able to really be on the offense once again and profit from doing these things. But try it small scale at the beginning and figure out what's going to work best. You don't have as much of the daylight as what I've got. You don't have as many days of growing season, but this could be a really key opportunity. Well, I love this one as well. I talked about diversifying and implementing this principle of diversity to find other markets with the barley, with the mustard, things like that. But with the rye, my market is cover crop seed, a growing market right there, high value seed quality product that I could put into the marketplace to help us to drive the profitability on our farms. I was talking with Dad about his final numbers and stuff, as we were wrapping up the year last year. And where we relay cropped, our bottom line profitability was increased by $300 an acre over where we didn't relay. We're going to do the majority of our acres going to soybeans here this next year in that system because it's been working real well. Now, another thing with all this stuff, planting green, taking a long time, I have to throw out the caveat in there. Talk to your crop insurance person. You can tell them I sent you. That's fine. But don't get in trouble there, or figure out a way to work with your crop insurance person. Or if you have to do some of this stuff and it's outside of compliance, try it small scale at the beginning and make sure that you're not taking on too much risk for your operation. For us, we did it without crop insurance. It was a risk worth taking. Like I said, the dollars are really there. And even this year where we were ultra dry, we only had 4 inches of rain on our farm this year, and it still worked extremely well and is encouraging us to go and take it to the next level going forward. Rye has worked really well because of that height differential. 30 bushel an acre, it's nothing crazy on yields. We used Elbon rye this year. We've just used VNS rye in the past. And you can see my tire there too. We've got fat tires on the combine. We're running over plenty of soybeans. In the last 3 years of replicated trials, the average soybean yield loss has been 3/4 of a bushel yield loss. That's it. Averaging still right about 70 bushel the acre soybeans. No significant difference from my typical soybeans into rye program where I go out there and spray it off. This year was our first year where we did lose some yield. My soybeans averaged 58 bushel the acre. The normal stuff was about 68 bushel the acre. But again, that being back to we had 4 inches of rain. And I've got a 30 bushel the acre cereal rye crop, and I'm trying to grow a 70 bushel the acre soybean crop, and 4 inches of rain just didn't cut it. But again, even with that yield loss, the profitability was still $300 an acre better than our full yield soybeans. Back to profit, not just yield. I think we heard Dr. Nichols talking about that before too. Just cutting right over the top, this is what it looks like. And then at the end of the year, going through and harvesting really great soybeans and causing improved benefit for a multi-year rotation, getting us more value for our corn crop the following year. And by really pushing on soybeans overall, getting more legumes into the system, we've cut our fertilizer by more than a third, getting close to 40% or so without losing yield. So we've cut our nitrogen fertilizer by about 40%. We've cut our phosphorus fertilizer by 90%. We got rid of potash 8 years ago. We got rid of lime. We're now on 12 years, I think, of no lime. And utilizing some of these dollars to go back into humics and sugar and micronutrients and getting those other limiting factors that can help to balance this system. The toughest of these principles to make work on our operation is livestock. I'm sure there's plenty of you here that have this as a better opportunity than what I've got on my farm. But this one is really what completes the system. For me, because I'm running around doing talks and stuff all the time and Dad's on boards and all that, not a person there to be able to make this work on our operation at this point. Like I said, to me, I would have to get another young producer that wants to regeneratively graze and rotate livestock. I would need to work with them to make this work on my operation. So for today, it's making these critters out there work for me and making that natural system be part of my livestock integration, trying to be as good as we can for that holistic system. We've been looking at pheasant populations and other nesting birds and stuff as well, really seeing some of these things come back. But of course, getting the actual livestock out there, that making this work as an integrated system is really the key thing. Last kind of stuff here. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but wanting to get into maybe a couple more questions and stuff anyway. It's about right on time. Like I said, I'm hanging out and stuff here later too. Happy to chat and happy to talk on some more stuff. But the overall thing here is, as you're looking at these soil health principles, as you're taking systems away from the talks you've heard today or hearing from Rick Clark and others tomorrow, you got to take these things into the context of your operation. All of our farms are going to be different. That's why regulation is not the answer here. One-size-fits-all solutions are not the answer here. Check-the-box programs are not the answer here. It's going to be different for every single one of your operations. My bio actually got an update. We're actually in 42 states and 20 countries now, and seeing that this has got to be very different for every single one of our operations. Utilize data and work to make the right decisions. The tried and true is work with Mother Nature, not against her. Use these principles for offense. Control your costs. Control your productivity. Control as much as you can control on your own operation. But at the same time, back to the opportunities in the marketplace, this is a big deal. Okay, I talked about carbon intensity before. Carbon intensity and these supply chain connected systems are what I believe is the future of all this, what I'm seeing being developed right now. And a lot of it comes because of what happened at COP26 last year, where some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, controlling 60% of the global wealth, about $130 trillion under management, they all said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Those are the big banks, the holding companies that own all the companies on Wall Street and all that. These guys saying we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. For a financial institution to be carbon neutral by 2050, their portfolio has to be carbon neutral. All these companies, all the corporates and stuff that we interact with on our operations. In order for those corporates and those supply chains to be carbon neutral, it takes us. We're part of their scope 3 footprint. We're part of their carbon footprint. And they need us to help to meet their corporate sustainability goals, to help meet the goals of their financial institutions. Huge opportunity to get this dialed in, document, learn, make sure that you're using these systems for offense, and we'd love to help and be part of your journey in any way that we can. This is an amazing group that you guys have going here. In Iowa, we're talking about starting a soil health coalition down in Iowa. Really excited to be up here and continue to learn from you all. Commend you for being here in this room. It's amazing to see so many folks, and just know you're really on the right journey here. Regenerative ag is going to continue to happen. Only 4% of farms in the country using cover crops right now, but we know that this regenerative path is the right one to be on. And because you're in the room, you're seeing the future. You've got the upper hand here, and especially as we go into this growing season and into the future, a perfect opportunity to reflect and to look at long term, where do you want to position your operation, where do you want to position yourself, and where do you want to set up for future success. Ensure profitability now, but the opportunities coming down the pipeline are really exciting for all of us in this space. So appreciate you letting me share some insight. And yeah, if we've got time, maybe another question or two. But like I said, grab me here later. I got to take off early tomorrow morning, but I'll be happy to hang out and chat here tonight as well. Thanks. Got any other? Back over there? I don't know where our mic guys are. Yeah, great question. So our question's on speaking to the residue level after we harvest the relay, soybeans especially, or like the rye residue. Yeah. So when we're harvesting, like when we harvest the rye, there's not a lot of material going through. One of the changes that we did in this system was we did get a draper head. It's the only major equipment change we've made on our operation. We got the draper head because when we're harvesting the rye over the top, you're only getting about this much of that material through, and at only 60 pounds of seed per acre, 30 bushel rye, there's just not a lot of material going through there. So the draper head helps to keep it coming through. So there's not a lot going out the back, not a lot of coverage on the top of the soybeans. When we harvest the soybeans, you got all that rye straw out there, and that draper head really helps to move all that material through the combine in a more even manner. And we've been able to do really well. Now, there's plenty of residue coming out the back, of course. I've got basically 12,000 pounds of rye biomass, and I've got all that soybean biomass. There's a lot of material out there, but we still go in and still plant more cover crop directly into that, prepare that offensive system for our corn the following year. And now in our system, I have an issue again with keeping residue on the surface. There's plenty of it there. It definitely adds to that additional habitat. But the relay cropping, we didn't get started in that until 4 or 5 years into this journey. You know, it's not a first year cover cropper 101 level thing to do. It's experiment with it. Be more aggressive with your soybeans and your rye grown together first, then take a look at being more aggressive as you go. And to your point, especially as your microbiome starts building up and you need more residue out there, especially if we've got that cereal rye residue that's got a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio mixed with that soybean residue with a really low carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now we've got a more balanced food source going in there for our microbes to be decomposed over the winter and be ready for our cash crop the following year. Yes, sir. Good question. This question's on, do we have volunteer rye? Oh, yeah. Now, with the rye, and especially Elbon rye, we liked because it was more even, more consistent, more seed heads that were up here and less spindly ones that were all over the place. So this year, it's a lot better. We get a little bit of volunteer coming out the back, but because that soybean canopy is so thick, it's very, very minimum growth out there in the fall anyway, so it hasn't caused any major issues. But there is a little bit of rye out there, so we can reduce our seeding rates in the fall, sometimes maybe not even seed anything at all. I think Dave Brandt does plenty of this type of stuff as well, and he jokes about his silver seeder, his gleaner combine. His gleaner combine's throwing all this seed right out the back, but shoot, Dave doesn't care. He was going to plant more seed anyway. If the natural system does it for him and it's spread it out even enough, good to go. For us, we haven't had enough volunteer out there to warrant not planting anything. We always plant a little something back. Plus, I typically am planting a diverse blend because I'm going to corn the following year, so I want to have more diversity and more even coverage to suppress weeds. But one of the last piece with that being soybeans into cereal rye do have a more elongated stem, especially at the bottom. So what we found is we don't have to scalp the soil as much as like we used to. We can leave that cutter bar up a little bit and not have to run as much of that grass through because the bottom pods are off the ground a little bit. Now, again, it's part of you making sure that you fine tune everything else. We're planting the soybeans early into the cereal rye and using light rates of cereal rye because we need to let those soybeans compete with the rye and not just be elongated internodes and be super rank and stemmy and then fall over and we got a freaking mess come the fall. So we're planting them early. The bottom internodes elongate, but then they stack and we're able to get those good yields that we want. Also, we've got the straw out there to help hold those soybeans up, and we're seeing a lot less disease and a lot less insect pressure and stuff in this system as well. I think part of that is I've got that dry straw that's standing up there that helps to wick out excess moisture and help me to avoid white mold and some of those things that we always used to battle in our drilled soybean system.
Going back to your carbon credits,
Yeah.
and oftentimes a lot of these programs do benefit the crop side of it, but we know that some of our greatest carbon capture is through our grasslands.
Yeah.
And are they going to address that? And there's here to be an example. Let's say you take some marginal land, put it into CRP. Are you going to be able to get some kind of credit for that?
I haven't seen that yet within the CRP side, but there's a company called Working Trees that you can look at where they're looking at silvopasture and looking at having trees and grasslands integrated. That might be one of the things to look at. Also, Pasture Map was at one point looking at some of the broadacre stuff, and then Land Values is another one. They're a Montana-based startup company that is really focused on the rangeland side of things as well. So Land Trust, Pasture Map, and Working Trees. But very different, once again, in these systems. And that, again, is we got to keep in mind here the difference between carbon offsetting, where you're getting paid for the change in practice, versus what's going into the supply chain here. And if you've got cattle that are integrated into that system, you don't have the grain as part of their scope 3 impact of that cow or of that animal. Instead, you've got that natural system that doesn't have near as big of an environmental footprint, and we can have ultra low environmental impact, meat products going into the supply chain. Okay, look at in my neck of the woods, it's a lot on the pigs. Okay, for the same type of instance, and some numbers here for you. For a pig, about 65% of that pig's carbon footprint comes from the feed that it eats. About 10% of the pig's carbon footprint is getting it to market in the diesel fuel, and the remainder is from the manure and from the direct usage of that pig. But the big chunk of it is the feed going into it. This is very similar for other livestock here as well. Of that bushel of corn, more than 60% of the carbon footprint of a typical bushel of corn is from the nitrogen fertilizer and from the nitrous oxide impact. And a huge opportunity to really fine-tune your carbon footprint on a carbon intensity standpoint is reducing synthetic nitrogen. The reason for this, number one, producing synthetic nitrogen, getting nitrogen from the atmosphere that's 70% nitrogen, and getting it into a product takes a lot of natural gas, takes a lot of electricity, very energy intensive to do the Haber-Bosch process. But also, when you put nitrogen out there in the field, plenty of it is lost as nitrous oxide, especially in wet soils, or if we're over-applying fertilizer and it's not able to be utilized correctly. Nitrous oxide has just about 300 times the global warming impact versus a ton of CO2. Okay, so that's why they're talking about in carbon equivalents and carbon credits. It's based on carbon and 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's also methane is about 30 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon, CO2. And nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent a greenhouse gas than that CO2. So being able to get the livestock out there, grazing some of these things, not having to have the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer as part of that supply chain is a huge opportunity to dial this in from a carbon intensity standpoint of those animals. We got one more. We got a color good.
I think that's about enough for questions.
I'll hang out, and I'm happy to dig into this more. And I'll keep posted on our sites and stuff. Again, this is very, very new, and would love to to keep in touch with updates. But again, thanks everyone.
Well, I'd like to take this time again to thank Mitchell for coming up and showing us what he's been doing, not only on their operation, but also the platforms that he's been working with, just to kind of try and help farmers and move everybody in the right direction. So we have another gift as well for him from the board.
Thanks,
so.
guys.